Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Emma. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an event coordinator here at Shelf Life Books. We are very excited to host David Martin's book launch for Limited Verse, joined in conversation by Colin Martin. In Mokhinstsis, on the lands of the Treaty 7 people, including the Blackfoot from Saiksika, Gaina, and Bagani, the Dene Sarsi from Sutina, and the Stoney Nakoda from Morley, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney First Nations. We also walk in the footsteps of the Métis people from Region 3, Métis Nation of Alberta. A few little housekeeping notes. You can grab them, you can find them up at the till, or for those joining us online, they are available through our e-store. Washrooms are available through the door to your right, and some refreshments can be found at that back corner. And now I'd like to welcome Brian Scrivener to the stage to say a few words.
Thanks, Emma. I'm Brian Scrivener, Director of University of Calgary Press and proud publisher of David's new book. Occasionally we do publish books from the past or editions of older poetry. Well, we often publish books from the present, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've published poetry from the future. David, I'm sure most of you know, with the Single Onion reading series, are Tar Swans and Kink Bands. Are they both by New West, or both from our friends at New West? Mm-hmm. So buy those too. And we also have with us Colin Martin, no relation, who had a significant hand in the development of the book, according to David. So to be Ezra Pound to David's T.S. Eliot.
Oh dear Lord.
Right. So this book, our literary series is called Brave and Brilliant, and this book ticks both boxes. And so I hope you'll enjoy it and enjoy the rest of the evening. So I hand it over to you two right now. David, I think we'll do it.
Thanks everyone for coming. So I'm just going to dive in and read from the book, and then Colin and I will have a little chat to hopefully make some sense of what's going on. If you're reading this material, it is likely that your memory is clean and you have been harmonized into New English. Or I myself may be the one who is reading this with a clean mind. One way or the other, I decide to go on with this work. The persons have made it known that there is a small number of days till the time I am to go from this place. I am writing while resting on my bed in a small room within the prison. It is quiet now. Most of my brothers and sisters are in sleep, but I am not able to sleep. I desire to complete this purpose before transport with me, any materials in the Old English or even my memories. Only a small number of records are given authority to join me on the journey. That is why I've been writing with such great force. As I faced the weathered brick walls of my room, I decided that I would take a selection of verse with me for my new consciousness. The verse would be my memory of old earth, and even with a clean memory, I hope to be able to relearn my times and this verse when I join the others. This writing will be a servant to memory, an art living outside the mind. Upon landing, all of us are to be a clear canvas for New English. It is a harmonized language for connection between the others, brothers, sisters, and those who made the now learning the language within my room in the prison so that I may transform these verses. I need to mark my regrets to my future self, my new earth self at this point. There will be a great number of verses that I was not able to transform before transport. This writing was all I had power to complete. While the transformations are not without error, they are the best I was able to say. Brothers and sisters, and all those behind walls who will have memories cleaned and minds harmonized into New English. May we keep this small art in our hearts and keep the time of old earth forever green within us and over us. stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I seem to know. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods turn full with snow. My little horse will feel its fear to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and ice that wings, the darkest evening of the year, he gives his bells a lowly ring to ask if there's an answering. The only other sounds like sheep of simple wind and downy things. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have my agreements to keep, and long to go before I sleep, and long to go before I sleep. I have in hand art that is distant from its root, very much like knowing that I may never completely connect with the natural around me, but art is ever the sign of the attempt to connect. Whose room is next to mine? I have never seen his face, but when it is quiet at night, we are able to give words to one another. I said to him my idea of secretly transporting verse with me to our new home. He, as well, is at work on a design to keep a record of his old days and memories. He has not said more than that, maybe in fear that I will give away his secrets. It is like an electric smile takes over my face. Maybe one day I will see his face with the same smile. That time of year you may in me unfold, when yellow leaves, or one or two, do hang upon those trees which shake against the cold, wasted harmony, where late the sweet birds sang. In me you see the sundown of such day as after light has fallen in the west, which by and by black night will take away, death's second self that shuts up all in rest. In me you see such fire is in its burning, that on the ends of his young days is placed, as the deathbed on which will end the turning, destructed by the thing which gave it face. This you sense, which you must drop before long. I questioned my brother in the next room about his thoughts on love. He was very quiet before answering. He said to me that for some time after coming to the prison, he desired destruction of the love he felt in his heart. It was overly painful to have such feelings, he said, when he would never again see the faces and places that were so special to him. Later, though, he started to guide his feelings to a secret sky in himself. His growth of love was a protest from within, something the persons would never touch. I questioned him if his feelings would change when his words changed, if his love would change when his memory was clean. Yes, he said, love will be different at that time, but the feeling is part of our existence. Even if we loves will be wiped clean, and if we see the names, the memory will be gone. But I believe love will be living in our new system. It is true that we have changed the language of our verse about love. But what is key is that I will bring sense to love through verse, even if it needs to be kept secret from the persons who desire to attack such arts. Turning and turning in the widening circle, the knife bird does not hear the branch man. Things fall apart, the middle has no use. Lawlessness is sent far across the earth, blood-darkened waves are loosed, and everywhere the religion of peace slips under water. The best have dropped their nerve, while the worst are a heart-strong, burning engine. Truly, the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Quickly I say those words with a great picture out of the earth's mind troubles my eyes. Somewhere in the sand wastes a form with cat body and the head of a man, with a look of war as cruel as the sun, is moving its slow legs, while all about it turn shades of the bitter wasteland birds. The 2,000 years of stony sleep were twisted to poisoned nights by a strange bed. And what rough animal, its hour come round at last, is bent now to Bethlehem to be given birth? Some think such hard rules will break us, but the persons say that from rules we will find true freedom. The harder the rules prison, the greater the mind's purpose and power of expansion. I say this to myself when I am writing, the more limits for my verse, the more freedom. I hear an army. I hear an army attacking upon the land, and the thunder of horses muscling, white about their knees. Self-important, in black curtains, the drivers are pleased. They cry out to the night their warring name. I cry in sleep when I hear, from afar, their brightest flame. Hammer, hammer upon the heart as upon steel. They come shaking authority in their long green hair. They come out of the sea and run, burning when they're faced. My love, my love, my love, why have you left me in waste? I questioned my brother in the next room if he had knowledge of any crime in his old days that might have poisoned his future. He said that he had no memory of such a crime, but when the word was made clear, he would feel a darkness within. The living in New English, they said, would be open and free. I had been careful to observe all the rules of New English as I had made my verse transformations. I knew that if I did not, when I awoke in New English with a clean mind, I would be unable to read such words as those beyond our language. I place these verses as a hook upon the language to guide me back to my old days, not simply be a waste. The red wheel cart. So much hangs upon a red wheel cart, silvered with rainwater, beside the white birds. I hope my prophet will be that in New English, nothing is lost. First verses, but they will keep their memory living in the same way that a son's face records the father's. My language will be limited, but verse is an art that is forever without limit, without rest. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves rest serious under the earth. Stiff and yesterday or years before whipped. The feet, machine-like, they go round. A wooden way, a floor or air or anything. A growth unknown, jeweled harmony like a stone. This is the hour of lead, recorded, if outlived, as icy persons reminded of the snow. First, cold. I have written a small number of my own verses, and I make them part of this vessel not as equals to those that came before, but because they are another frame for memory and feeling of my time on old earth. Verse is an artful carriage for thought, and my mind is moving over the face of the earth, from the dirt to the sky. Step round the waters where the trees are in line. The leaves there now restlessly, bitterly green. It's so great the years from my thought to return, that everything everywhere's changed what is seen. The flowers and colors are light on the breath, and I in the middle of the walk of my trade. But colors and flowers are crying at time. You say you don't hear it the day, but hear with me nearer, and it will grip you. The cries of the earth crying, run, run away. My last writing before transport. If these words are uncovered by me or my brothers and sisters when we wake and remake a memory of old earth, the old English will be gone, but thought is able to stretch beyond the limit of language and touch the deepest part of us. Please do not punish these verses for what they are not, but keep them close to your heart for what they are. From my old self to my new self, good day and so long. And just a couple of thank yous before we have a little chit chat. I wanted to thank Colin for all his suggestions and questions that helped turn this manuscript from a really vague, wacky idea into what would become a book. And I wanted to thank Helen Hinoski, Melina Kazano, Alison Cobra, Brian Scrivener, Aretha Van Herk, and the whole University of Calgary Press for all their amazing work in bringing this book to the world. Spot. I'm always happy to be here. So now Colin and I will try and have a discussion.
All right.
Do you want to sit there?
There are dozens of people waving at you from the agenda, by the way.
Sorry?
Dozens of waving.
Okay. So maybe to kind of start things off, let's talk a little bit about where this manuscript came from. We could do this in character, or talk about the conceit itself. So it is a manuscript from the future. That is, it is discovered in their past of New English literature, which is a burgeoning field of academic study. New English being what people were trained to speak in based on something that, you know, had its moment during the modernist period. C.K. Ogden crafted this thing called Basic English. 850 use to communicate everything that really mattered in English, and it would become a universal lingua franca. And so we can talk a lot about what's embedded in that. But in 2057, something bad is going to happen. There's ended up often politically adverse people and shipped off to New Earth as laborers, and their minds will be wiped, their memories cleaned, and they will be taught New English so that they can speak in harmony with each other and language of old Earth. This manuscript is that of one such about to get his transport. And we don't know a whole lot more about him than that, do we?
There's not a whole lot known about. It's called the Translator. That's what the academics kind of refer to that person as. So there's some different layers kind of nested within the book. There's the translated poems, and this is going to happen to my memory and my language, and then there's kind of this frame of these academics who are further in the trying to kind of sort through this history to explain it to you. And the book has kind of a historical, factual side to it to a certain point, and then from there kind of takes this more speculative fiction leap. So as you mentioned, like Basic English was a real thing developed in the 20s and 30s by C.K. Ogden. And it kind of had a benign side, which is like, hey, what if we want to teach people English? This is a really good way to do it. Just give them these 850 words. We've kind of figured this out. But there was sort of like a darker side too about how this could be a world language, and people were sort of concerned about that sort of authoritarian side or from a colonial side. And it kind of caught on. By the 1940s, though, it started to die out, and it wasn't really in use anymore. And then, but there was a strange book that H.G. Wells wrote called The Shape of Things to Come, which again is like a letter from the future talking back to us or something. And in that one, he talks about how Basic English did catch on and did become a world language. So I kind of used that little stepping stone to think of was taken on globally, forced on certain people, and then just kind of kept going from there. So if you're sort of reading the footnotes at the back, a lot of them are factually correct. I did a lot of research about Basic English, and then at some point, then there's it goes into sort of the more speculative side. But hopefully you don't notice that transition too closely. And yeah, 800. That's sort of your box of words that you get, And the idea is like that's all you need to express yourself. And in this case, the translators wants to use that container to transport poetry.
Yeah, and that actually explains for me. There's an H.G. Wells quote, and I quote he's writing from the future because that makes so much more sense to me now, because I was like, this was not something I ever remembered reading by him. And the frame of the book then is the two academics who find this, they're really pumping up this manuscript, right? Like they think that this has literary significance and merit, but a lot of the poems are actually revisions or rewritings of iconic poems in basic English. So how is that did you see that as a process of like translation?
I thought of it as translation.
Because it's still English to English.
It's still English to English, but it's such different than sort of the standard English. And essentially it made me think like a translator, which is if you don't have a word for something in like the language you're going into, how do you deal with that problem? Do you, in some instances, you could sort of explain whatever you're talking about in a number of words, like if you don't have a word for table or something like that, or you probably would have a maintain kind of the structural elements of the poem that you're translating. So I tried to be really strict with the rhymes and the meters and all that stuff. And so to me it felt like a translation. I only really speak English and New English, so so I've never really experienced, say, translating from French to English, other than like elementary school or something like that. Those little attempts are probably similar to what a translator, like if there's words beyond a certain culture or outside of a certain language, how do you take that into your target language that you're going? What does it mean to bring it across like that? What are you losing? What is the reader kind of missing out on? But also, is it sort of a generative process to make that?
Yeah, well, and I mean, you're drawing from poems that are, I think all of them were originally written in English. But speaking of like drawing from different cultures, I mean, the contexts and cultures and times of those poems are wildly varied. You have Shakespeare on one hand, and then you have Zong by Rachel Zoll.
The academics mention and Norbe say Zong, but I don't translate it.
Okay.
So
okay.
The poems that are translated tend to be kind of like classic poems that you would find in an anthology, and it's the academics kind of wonder about this, that perhaps the person found like an old anthology and sort of was going through, this is sort of what I want to hang on to.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, it goes, there's Chaucer up to poets in the Harlem Renaissance, Shakespeare, Imagist poets like William Carlos Williams. So there's different kind of historical registers of English in the original poems, and then you could have a question what happens when they.
And how was that as a process, writing those poems or rewriting those poems? Especially given that so many of them are poems actually that I think people, even some of the ones that you were reading, people started to recognize it. William Carlos Williams or Robert Frost.
Yeah, I chose those deliberately. I always at the back of my mind was this sense that people would think that I'm ruining poems that they love. These poems memorized, or this just kind of a part of them. And so by changing them, in a way, I'm kind of wrecking them. But my hope is that there is still a sense of beauty in this weird, restricted version that I'm creating for the poems. From the process of creating the book, and there were some poems that were not in English, and so I would try and use Google Translate and then to New English and that kind of stuff, and that kind of got out of hand. But so I like the idea of kind of narrowing it down, saying we're just going from English poems to New English, and particularly the strain of trying to maintain what the original poem was doing, whether it was like syllabic count for her poems. So in my poem, I have the same syllable count. If the original poem rhymes, my poem has to rhyme. If it's in a sonnet, then it's got to be a sonnet. So all of the original constraints that the poet was working under are still kind of present in the New English poems. And then one of the key ideas is that even with this, really, you limit yourself to 850 words, and it has to rhyme and it has to be metered, that you can still make something from that. And that paradoxically, there actually is creativity that sort of shows up in those moments that maybe you wouldn't expect if you hadn't have applied all of those limitations to your work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something we had talked about.
Well, yeah. Well, and some of the translators' notes in the notebook that accompany some of the poems, in one, it mentions the idea that, you know, we will find freedom in this constraint of a limited lexicon of 850 words. Did you feel that you were finding freedom by operating?
Freedom, but I did find like sort of creative things that I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. So there's certain words in the New English lexicon that you have to really lean on, you know, so suddenly a word like silver, which is sort of a special word, like you got to use that one because, you know, you don't have a lot of these sort of special words. But, you know, there's a number of writers, like the French Oulipo group, you actually become more creative and you can find things you wouldn't normally have done. There's a quote from Stravinsky that, like, by setting limitations, that's where you find sort of the freedom. And the idea is, I don't know if I totally believe this, is that we have kind of unconscious restrictions on our creativity. We're just not really aware of them. But if you make them limitations, have this box of words, but what can I do with it?
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of like one of the main drivers of the book is, yeah, what can you do with this small box of words?
Yeah, it's like how first they would try to remove the constraints and find absolute freedom, and then the poetry all just started sounding the same anyway. But some original poems as well. So it's organized thematically. There's a section on death, or love, religion. And then you close with a section of original poems. Now, were those poems that you wrote within the basic English lexicon for this book, or were they poems you had written?
I think it was a mix. I think some I wrote just sort of straight into the language, and then some I took poems that I had kind of sitting around and then tried to translate them in. So yeah, there's 7 sections in the book, like nature, love, religion, language, and sort of the idea is to kind of cover like a person's life. And in the 7th section, in sort of trying to tie up things up, so there's like 1 love poem and 1 nature poem at the end, and they're the original ones. And the translator says, you know, I'm not putting my poems on the same level as these Shakespearean poems, but I still want to add something to it and show my own creativity, and again to kind of pull something from my memory for my future self. It was kind of strange writing in New English.
Mm-hmm.
I still had to keep my word lists handy, but I got to the point where if I found some other book that was in basic English or something, I could read through that and then see where they were like cheating, like, oh, you're not allowed to use that word. So I wasn't like 100% fluent, but pretty close. But now I probably have to kind of get back into it. My kids thought it was weird because
Well, even C.K. Ogden is kind of doing that as well in just crafting, because there's a section on like things, and then there's other things, and then there's like qualities, and then there's inverse qualities or opposites, you know.
One of them is like operators. Instead of like verbs, he had sort of his own grammatical categories, which are a little bonkers, but and yeah, so he came up with sort of like grammatical rules, sort of fairly basic ones. And then I would have to kind of think like, am I allowed to modify a certain word? Is that breaking the rules? Would my translator then be able to understand that word? So like in in the W.B. Yeats one, you mentioned Bethlehem. So, you know, technically the translator, once they've gone through this process of harmonization, probably wouldn't know what that word meant. But there's going to be things that are not, that they don't have access to once they're in that position.
Yeah, all the, or any proper nouns, because for any of that to work, they have to all be removed with their associations.
Yeah. So the name, the authors of the poems were then kind of added in by the academics. They kind of tucked them in at the end of each poem, because for the translations and history of that word Shakespeare, other than it just being a name.
Yeah.
So that was another kind of question that would come up.
Well, so Ogden's crafting, first of all, a lexicon, then a kind of a workable grammar that might make basic English actually function. Sort of became
He teamed up with I.A. Richards, who was like another pseudo-linguist and sort of a literary theorist. And it started to be used in China to teach people English. Like, it did catch on in that way. It was used in sort of a larger way. What was strange is there's a number of authors, like Ezra Pound, for a brief time George Orwell, who were very in favor of basic English. They were kind of intrigued by this. And so I did a lot of research, because it seems really strange. Like, these are all kind of highfalutin modernist poets. Why would they want this sort of like simplified language? And there was different theories that it would kind of help their work disseminate further. But then probably the best pose it's simplified language, that there's something special about what these modernist writers were doing, and that it's not just sort of surface level fancy words, that there's something kind of true in their work that can survive in basic English. Orwell changed his mind, and so he saw like the authoritarian side of it. And so in 1984, when he's coming up with things like basic English, but James Joyce allowed a section of Finnegan's Wake to be translated into basic English, and it was published in a journal. So like he wasn't against it. He wanted to see what it could do, I think. So there's like weird histories with the people involved in the basic English, and keep going with it. That it's not just a historical thing, but what if there were sort of this futuristic narrative?
Yeah. And so, did you find yourself really kind of imagining the narrator? Is this a person who exists in your imagination?
I think I started to, yeah, especially thinking about the translator talks about like having the neighbor in the cell beside them, trying to make this connection. Towards the end, there's sort of this hint that maybe like he can't talk to that person anymore, like maybe that person has died. He's trying to think back through the history of his life a little bit. You know, they've maybe committed some sort of crime, but they don't really have a lot of information. So on the one hand, it's kind of a silhouette of a character. It's not like a novel where you sort of really get inside someone's mind, but it did feel like a person. And then the conclusion to that sort of translator's life, and they're very sort of cruel about it, just sort of that this person didn't survive, you know, their journey to New Earth, and the manuscript was found on their person. And so just to talk about the physical book, so this is supposed to be like the journal that they find, and then there's facsimiles of the poems which the translator there's someone who writes a little introduction, Dr. T.E. Braithwaite, Professor Emeritus of Literature, West Stanford
The
University.
names of the academics are delightful.
Washington, British Columbia, and then there's like little bios for the academics, Dr. Edward A. Threepwood and Dr. Naomi Williamsburg, post-glacial literatures. So I don't know. It's like
Post-glacial literatures.
Those are my little cruel jokes. Yeah.
And then, of course, there are some voluminous notes at the end of the book. One of my favorite books will always be page is 252 words. There's 253 of these pages, each for a person who would be on a train in the London Metro before it crashes. They're all going to die. And as you go through the book, you get more and more of these character sketches give you more and more of the story. And I kind of felt that there was a similar sort of process going on here. And then when I got to the several pages long, so the constraint of 253 words per page is completely blown out of the water. And I felt like that was sort of where you and your friendly academics just kind of went.
Because they're not writing a new little bit of new English, combines it with standard English. And their goal is to say, like, there is value in this sort of field of restricted creative work. And that's what that other professor says, is like, you know, we're starting to examine these plays and novels, and it sort of assumes that there's other works of art in it.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's any disagreement between the scholars. I know that earlier, Colin, you mentioned that this was a penal colony there. I was told that it was a utopia. Like, this was a place that we were chosen to visit. This isn't the place where we were sent to suffer.
The people being sent there are the workers, perhaps building what would have been a utopia. And so the workers are often going against their will, and they've been harmonized into this language, so they've come from all around the world. This way they can communicate with each other seamlessly.
And scholars are agreed that this is in fact the case. There's no dissent.
They say the history of New Earth, which didn't go that well, is covered in this other book, The Decline and Fall of New Earth, written by so-and-so, and they say you should read that book. So sometimes speculative fiction authors sort of, in a Tolkien way, kind of create their entire world. In this case, I'm just kind of like hinting at other aspects of it to show that they're there without necessarily.
But we need a Silmarillion here. I mean, craft that book. The utopia, perhaps astonishingly, seems to have failed. Political tensions seem to have risen. Yeah.
It has that Margaret Atwood thing, and she had to use prose to go to do that dystopian mythopoeic rendering, and you stayed in poetry. It's just really hard to do.
Sounds bonkers. How do I explain what I'm doing? This will never be published. Thanks, UFC.
So how did it ever get published?
No, it is brilliant. I mean, just I was going to ask you through this whole forensic process. Is there anything about your craft that you learned through that process that you might apply in your future writing?
I think following this one, I started to write more formal poetry for my own works, and I liked the idea. I researched more poets who would talk about this. A lot of poets, that sounds passe. You know, we've gone beyond that, but it's hard. Can you do it? Can you try and do it well and make it sound contemporary? And then maybe you find things that you wouldn't normally find. And so poets like A.E. Stallings, who's the current Oxford poetry professor, who's brilliant, and she has this essay called Presto Manifesto, and you're investigating what the language can offer you, and you're making your mind think in different ways. And so, yeah, I think it did, because I have other manuscripts that I'm working on that are much more formal than I would have ever done prior to this. And it didn't really frighten me as much to like set wild limits on some kind of a poem or project that I'm working on to see what I can do with it. Kathy.
The environment, and it was unintentional because you were also restricting your language. Was it the use of the prison intentional?
I'm not sure how intentional it was, but I like the idea that the translator is in a cell in sort of this small room, and they're using their imagination to get beyond their confinement. Poetry itself, that poets are trying to speak to things beyond the language that they can normally express. They're using the language they have to try and express things beyond the language. This is sort of making that really clear and concrete, that you only get this, but how can you express the whole range of human emotion and experience.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think Will's.
And the question is basic English a good language? And 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree.
Same reservations that a lot of people did, which is I don't think I wanted to see it to be a global language because then it kind of feels like it's being forced on people. E.K. Ogden's idea that you only need this number of words.
It would be, how many words should a good language have?
It's always changing. But I had read some study about how many words did Shakespeare use. So we have more words now than Shakespeare did, like iPhone and things like that, microphone. And so, but are we further along than him in his poetic expression? I don't know. Josephine?
Yeah, the poems that you converted, was there one where you liked?
I think there was one you noticed. It was like by Edward Thomas, and he has a poem called The Owl, which I translated to The Night Bird. And my wife was annoyed because she wanted to look up the original, and she's like, "There's no poem called The Night Bird by Edward Thomas." But I think you liked my version better. I don't think I could say that because I really like Edward Thomas, but that my version is kind of blended with the original.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask me to like recite the Shakespeare poem, that my version is probably like kind of seeping in there a little bit.
Yeah.
I did get a little carried away. I translated T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland into New English. I decided not to put that in there just because it would sort of overwhelm the book. Poems, and there was whole sections of The Wasteland where I didn't have to change very much. The words he's using are all within my lexicon. Say there's a small poem by Gertrude Stein in here. There's not many that I had to change. And so for some people, like, these poets seem daunting or unreadable or unapproachable, but the words that they're using are all within my, limited language.
Well, that's funny because, I mean, if you think T.S. Eliot, you think, like, these are the poets who are precisely renowned for being daunting, impenetrable, and yet, actually, a lot of their stuff does survive that test. Was it Pound who actually said, "Hey, if it can survive translation, then it's got something to it. It's a meaningful piece of work."
In one of his, really something truly there. It's not just surface kind of decoration with language. That there really is something at the center of what they're doing, and that kind of explains why some of these authors were
survived specifically. I noticed, maybe I just misheard, it could have been, I know it's interesting that carriage would survive the apocalypse, but wheelbarrow would somehow get erased.
So this New English is based on the basic English of 850 words. And so it's actually kind of an older English. It doesn't have the word car. It has the word trousers, but not pants. So it is kind of this, it's talking about their situation. There's certain things that they can't say, like they can't say pants, 'cause so they say trousers and things like that. Or you can't say wheelbarrow. You could say wheel, but I don't have barrow, so you're stuck. So then I was like, wheel cart.
So I'm fascinated by the idea of the constraint because I'm a literacy educator, and Dr. Seuss, Cat in the Hat, 50 words, and like that book was huge, still is huge in many circles. I worked primarily with English language learners. 850 words would be daunting for them coming here from, speaking your 150,000 words. But what I notice in these poems is we lose the imagery, we lose the broader language. And we know language is evolving, and I'm assuming that the translators of the translator, the older academics, have expanded English again. So we know that the language...
David, or his translator, says nightbird. Which bird comes to mind?
Mm-hmm.
Was it an owl? It isn't an owl for me. It's a hawk.
Oh, interesting.
And I don't know why that is.
There, I had an idea. If you take a fairly simple word like watermelon, and then this was in somebody's book, they had this like really long description. It's like, if you can't say watermelon, you have to say an egg-shaped fruit that is green on the outside and red on the inside and sweet to eat. And so that's ridiculous to, you know, if you can't circumlocution, like how do you talk about things? It's right there, you can see it. You can't call it a watermelon, so you call it something else. But that's again sort of like one of the roadblocks that comes up in translating the poems is, you know, what do you do if you have watermelon in a poem and you don't have the word watermelon? What if you were translating into another language and they didn't have a word for watermelon? Maybe they don't eat watermelons, or just not part of their culture or something like that. So, you know, that shows up sometimes in biblical translations and things like that, or translations from Chinese and Japanese into English and things like that. If you don't have the word for something, do you just like kind of swap it out, or what do you do?
Well, and you were talking about trousers and pants. In the UK, they still say trousers for trousers, and pants are underpants.
Yeah, that's probably why pants was not in.
Probably.
So you don't need pants.
Gaunch.
The constraint to bring number of words down would have profound effects on society, structure, thought, creativity. And then it came to my mind, before the word blue, the sky wasn't blue. It wasn't. There was no word for that.
No, we had to go with Cerulean.
What the color of that is, and it simply didn't exist before that. The color of that didn't exist in the lexicon, didn't exist in the mindset.
And so this is a controversial idea that came up in 20th century linguistics, is if you don't have a word for something, and you have a thought for something. And that's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now linguists will pull out their hair and say this is not true. And to them, there really is no distinction between thoughts and like the thoughts available in the languages that you have. But there can be a little bit, because some languages only have a few words for a few colors. All languages have a name for red. That's like the one word that all languages have. But some just sort of have like red and everything else. Some languages have, you know, words for more colors to a different degree than we do in English. So we would say, hey, the sky's blue, and they might say, you know, the sky is this particular shade of blue, and we have a word for that. Are they having a different thought than you are? Are they having a different perception than you are? So this is something linguists have kind of debated and argued about and tried to research. And so that also is kind of embedded in the poems, like if you can't name something, can you still...
Would you mind summarizing which components in your book are real and which ones are fictional? Because I'm still a little bit confused.
From the history side of it, it's all real until
2057.
So there's footnotes about C.K. Ogden coming up with this language. If he said language, you can sort of control their culture and who they are. And so all of that is like historically researched and real. And then you get to the point where it was kind of dying down. But then H.G. Wells, in his wacky novel, Written from the Future, said a point about that it came back into use, and I run with that into sort of a speculative fiction that now we're in the future, they're going to colonize a place called New Earth, they need workers to do this, they're going to force them to use New English, they're going to be harmonized into this language, their memory is going to be cleaned. That's all now speculative from there.
Which I believe is false.
Trust a poet.
And whatever happened to Esperanto?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
there was a lot of languages around this time of, you know, lingua francas, global languages. And with each one, there were sort of problems with it. Like Esperanto is the global language, but it has a lot of European roots. So people are like, well, is that really a global language? And C.K. Ogden tried to make, you know, a lot of people speak this other language. Maybe that could be the world language. So, and then there's the idea of, it's not just a language, but there's sort of like cultural and values and things that go along with the language, that you don't just sort of teach someone a language and they now have that language. They've sort of taken on that, maybe that cultural worldview to think about the world. And so it's not just sort of getting more with that.
36 notes.
Is that how many there are?
Yeah.
Some of them are pretty long too.
Did that beat T.S. Eliot? Didn't he have one?
In the Wasteland? I don't know.
That's curious.
Where can I find a dictionary of New English? Is that oh wow.
So you're constantly reminded that this is your cell, this is your box, this is your language. What can you make with this? And then at the end of the book is this is your appendix 1, a complete list of New English words in sort of the weird categories that they use, like your operations and your general words, qualities, 50 opposites, that kind of thing. This, you could at least get started. There were books that they came up with to try and explain their language, and they would like draw little stick people to try and sort of show like, a foundational level, how do you teach someone a language? So you're sort of naming things, you have actions to go with it, you have to construct a lot of work into it, and I have like a whole shelf of books about basic English.
Did it have the complexity of our verb tenses?
Because you do have fairly standard conjugations here.
Yes, the one thing you can't do is there's certain are not in the language. So you'd have to say like he is able to do something. You can't say he can do it. Or you can't say you should do this. Should and could are not in the language.
Oh, so like the modal verbs,
So there are some weird restrictions, yeah.
Okay.
Can you do something like I would have, like had this happened?
Yeah, you could say that, yeah. Verbs, just to make that kind of simplified. But again, you end up kind of talking around things sometimes. You're really pushing hard on verbs to like make them work harder than maybe they need to.
Yeah. Do you get to use would though when you're actually communicating something in the hypothetical subjunctive? Do I get to bring it? Okay, I'm going to stop right there.
In your experience of internet culture, do you find that people online tend to resort to these words more often than not?
I don't know. Someone designed a program called Simplish, and it tried to sort of use this language, and you could just sort of like put in your text and translate it.
Is it simple?
Translate it automatically. But the thing is, it can't handle poetry. It can't handle all the constraints of it. It gets stuck with certain words and just kind of highlights them as in like, I don't know what to do with that word. So it can make these like one-to-one simple conversions.
Did you try using a more, perhaps let's say, robust tool, AI tool or something like that to try and craft anything and see what it came up with?
I did try and use that website, like to say Simplish. Simplish it could work fairly okay with certain prose passages, but it would highlight it as in like in green, like, hey, we got it. In red, I don't know what's going on here, we can't do this. And then there's sort of these different colors. But poetry was really hard because, again, if it was like a word like watermelon or something, it would then have to sort of find its dictionary definition.
So like conceptualists love flouncing about and telling everybody that humans don't write poetry anymore, they write programs that write poetry, and that's just the way it is now. So I know that most of my students at university agree with them. And I wonder, as our broader population is like, yeah, why are you writing the poem? What's your response to that?
I think you still need like a human imagination behind it to act as an impetus, that it's not enough to sort of create a program that could make these, because there's all those hard decisions. I'm going to work around this, pick a different word, I still need to make this rhyme, I need to follow iambic pentameter. It still has to have like an emotional, it has to have someone to sort of evaluate its emotional content and not just say like, not to say this
Tory process, especially since you start using other source poems as source material, right?
Right. Am I the computer then?
Are you the computer, or are you the editor of the output? chooser. Jen.
So I have a comment. I do volunteer work in legal issues for vulnerable Calgarians, and one of the ladies I was talking to, a big case against some, whatever, it was a big case, so she had to do a lot of work. And I'm having a conversation with her in English, and she sounds eloquent. She sounds like she can speak English quite well. She presented, her last judge that she went before said, you don't have enough English to understand everything. I think there's an assumption that people can understand the complexity of full English, right? But they're kind of, I don't know, what my comment is, you can come across as being eloquent, and then if you're in the wrong environment, you really are missing a lot of information, right?
Mm-hmm. Between them, again, kind of getting back to that idea of like language and thought. If you have sort of one general term or sort of like a series of more technical terms, are you then kind of changing the way you're thinking and kind of getting into like finer and finer details and more subtle ways of thinking? Mm-hmm. Or can you still represent all of that complex detail? Maybe not so much in the legal world, but in lawmaking. Like there's some places now when you write a law, it can't be in legalese. It has to be sort of in plain English so that citizens can kind of understand.
Some jurisdictions have actually said that the rules of plain language need to be applied to all of those texts, and there is in fact a set of regulations. I'm going to say he, I'm assuming it's a man. In this room right now, I would challenge that he may not be sufficiently eloquent to appreciate the nuances of this conversation.
Yeah, it was a challenging thing because obviously if you don't know the legal terminology, that's one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a straightforward thing. You just don't know the definitions of the terms and just participate in any future court cases because of her restricted English skills. But she didn't sound like she had restricted
Sounds like overreach.
English skills.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my.
Is there a legal equivalent to New English?
I don't think so. So I'm not sure how they define Globish, which was 1,500 words for English. Basic English tried to expand a little bit. They came up with like 50 extra words. If you're doing science or something, like, okay, if you're going to be doing more technical stuff, you can have 50 more words. Or if you're in business, you can have a little bit more.
But doesn't challenges of learning English intact, which is that English itself isn't an organic language, it is composed of several other languages, and the lexicon in basic English is still drawn from many of those different language backgrounds, right?
Yeah, there's still a blend of kind of like the traditional Anglo-Saxon historical words and sort of the Germanic, named James Longenbach, who talked about one of the kind of great things about English is those two types of words kind of rubbing up against each other, those kind of Anglo-Saxon and then suddenly a longer Germanic multisyllabic word, and that still has something that can be accessed in New English is that's kind of dual
power, because English started as that the Angles and Saxons, they were Germans. Old English and Old German are remarkably similar. You can kind of get away with one if you know the
So
other.
I'm in Latin.
Yeah. 200 years it was illegal to speak, and then of course during the Renaissance, which understandably hit Britain 200 years later than the rest of Europe, they were like, wow, Latin's amazing. And they did it all over again. And it just continues to be there's a thread here that's like, yes, how does language speak to our language, reveal this other constraints upon us, the ones that are placed externally, the ones through which we have to regulate ourselves? What can you or can you not say? And if you can only use these words, can you foment an effective rebellion if the words of that rebellion are denied you?
because I'm thinking, how are we going to describe all the kinds of beer and all the shapes of pasta, and like, how are the
You say
adjectives
round,
holding
you
out?
say twisted. There's, but you can't name them all. Like you can't say lasagna
Dang.
or spaghetti, right? So you don't have all those names.
Tell me spaghettini last lived.
No.
Can you say cheese?
You can say cheese.
But
So
can you
what
say
is-
brie?
You can't say pasta.
Wow.
So you would have to talk about the food without naming it.
Wow.
But then maybe you're not going to eat it anymore if you can't name it. I don't know. Okay. Should probably wrap it up.
Yeah, just from the researcher's perspective, the introduction that sounds like the intended consequence was unintended consequences, and why did it ultimately fail?
They just kind of hint at that. They sort of say, we don't want to get into it too much. They talk about sort of that this was, these are kind of extreme human rights abuses. That people were imprisoned, they had their memories wiped, their language taken away, and then they mention, this has been explored in this other person's book. Go read that, where they kind of talk about that.
50 years, you'll have to wait until.
You have to wait until the future to find out what went wrong. Okay, maybe that's a good place to end.
I think we should all meet back here in a year, and we should all be prepared to speak in the new English.
And that's one of the tests they would use. Is when they were writing their books, they would say, "I bet."
Digital humanities, actually, one of the first things researchers do every single time is run a text or texts by a particular author through a word counter to find out who's using more or less complex language, and to what degree, and what the syllabic or spelling or other variations are. And I mean, ultimately they come up, I think, with the same stuff every time, which is that all of that is relevant to their context anyway, and it's kind of a pointless exercise. But they still love doing it. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This was a lot of fun. Thanks to Colin. Thanks to Calgary. Thanks to UC Press for taking out soon too. So.
It's special order.
Oh, okay.
If you order it, you'll get it.
I ordered some, so come talk to me. They're on their way from the U of T website. So
Yeah.
Nice.
thanks for doing the hardcover too.
Okay.
Right. It's gonna be a real notebook.
Yeah, that was amazing.